Chapter 1: Quiet Suburban Soldier. The sun had barely climbed over the rooftops when Javier Summers stepped out onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. The quiet of the neighborhood was something most people would describe as peaceful. Kids' bicycles leaned against white picket fences, a sprinkler arced across a freshly mowed lawn, and a mailman in shorts waved from 2 houses down. For Javier, it was the kind of silence that didn't comfort, it made him listen harder. His neighbors thought of him as that polite, quiet guy who works from home. Freelance security consultant. That was the official title. The truth was different. Before this life of block parties and grocery store coupons, Javier had spent 12 years in the kind of places where the air tasted like gunpowder and every handshake was an opportunity for betrayal. Special operations, deep insertion, high-value targets, deniable missions. He was good at it. Too good. Which was why they'd given him medals, and why they'd eventually told him to disappear. Now, on the surface, he was just another man in his late 30s, lawn trimmed, bills paid, marriage intact. At least, that's how it looked to the neighborhood. But Javier knew better than to trust appearances. Rebecca stepped out of the house behind him, dressed for work, navy pencil skirt, white blouse, hair tied neatly in that way that made her look like she belonged in a corporate brochure. She was beautiful, always had been, the kind of beauty that drew eyes in a room and never let them go. It was part of what had made Javier notice her years ago, back when he was still half in love with adrenaline. "Morning," she said, brushing past him toward her car. She didn't kiss him. Not unusual, but not right either. "You're leaving early," Javier said. "Yeah, meeting downtown." She didn't look him in the eye when she said it. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she glanced down quickly, thumb flying over the screen before she slid it into her bag. Javier took a slow sip of coffee. Another one of those marketing meetings? She was already halfway down the driveway. He didn't push. Pushing never got you answers. It only made people more careful with their lives. When she drove away, Javier stayed on the porch, watching her taillights disappear around the corner. He wasn't suspicious because of anything obvious. No lipstick on collars, no perfume that wasn't hers. It was the little things, the kind of details that most people's brains filtered out, but his never could. Late nights at the office that turned into phone died, couldn't call. Showers at odd hours. Smiling at texts she wouldn't explain. The way her purse stayed zipped tight if he walked into the room. It wasn't that he thought she was cheating, at least not yet. It was that his instincts, honed in places where missing a single detail could get you killed, were whispering. Something's off. Javier's office was the converted second bedroom upstairs. For computer monitors, 2 phones, a printer that never worked when it was supposed to. On the desk sat a military challenge coin, black metal, no insignia, just wait. A reminder. He logged into his morning workload. A small business client who needed their network secured from phishing scams. A personal protection plan for a wealthy retiree who thought his son-in-law was embezzling. Easy work compared to his old life. But his mind kept drifting back to Rebecca. In the field, he'd been trained to catalog human behavior like a file system. You learn someone's normal before you could spot their abnormal. Rebecca's normal had shifted. That evening, she came home late. Javier was in the kitchen, chopping onions for dinner. "Sorry," she said, tossing her bag onto the couch. Traffic was a nightmare. "Where from?" he asked casually. "Downtown." She avoided his eyes again, heading straight to the fridge for a bottle of water. Javier nodded slowly. "I thought your meeting was this morning." She froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for him to notice before smiling. I had another one this afternoon." The lie wasn't in the words. It was in the pause, in the way her shoulders stiffened ever so slightly. Over dinner, she talked about nothing, office politics, the price of gas, the neighbor's dog. Javier smiled, nodded, even laughed when appropriate. Inside, his brain was already working, quietly building a map of her new behavioral patterns. After she went to bed, he stayed in the living room, lights off, staring out the window at the quiet street. He remembered a briefing from years ago in a crumbling safe house in Kabul. The moment you stop listening to your gut is the moment you die. It wasn't death he was worried about now. It was the death of trust. The days followed a pattern. Rebecca left early, came home late, her phone never far from her hand. Javier's work gave him enough flexibility to watch, though for now, he didn't take it further than that. No tracking devices, no tailing her car. Not yet. He tried to push the thoughts away. Maybe she was just stressed. Maybe it was a big project. Maybe it was nothing. But maybe it wasn't good enough. In his world, maybe got you a flag-draped coffin. One Friday evening, she came home wearing a dress she hadn't worn in years. Dark red, elegant. Her makeup was perfect, hairstyled with the kind of precision she usually reserved for weddings. "You're going out?" he asked. "Yeah, girls' night," she said breezily, grabbing her clutch. "We're hitting a wine bar." He looked at her shoes. 4-inch heels. Not the kind of shoes you wore for a casual night, sipping Merlot with friends. "Who's going?" She listed a couple of names. He knew them. Knew they were harmless. Knew also that one of them had moved out of state 6 months ago. When she left, he stood at the window, watching her car fade into the distance again. It wasn't jealousy he felt. It was the tightening in his chest that came before an operation went loud. A coldness in his stomach that said, "You're being set up, you just don't know for what yet." Later that night, he was in his office again, but not working. He was staring at the challenge coin on his desk, running his thumb over the smooth black surface. The coin didn't have an emblem because the missions it represented didn't officially exist. Neither did the men who went on them. He thought about all the times he'd read enemy movements, learned their habits, and predicted their next step before they made it. It wasn't magic, it was discipline, awareness, and a refusal to ignore the small stuff. Rebecca was showing small stuff. And if his instincts were right, and they usually were, this was only the beginning. The next morning, Rebecca was already dressed when Javier came downstairs. "Another early day?" he asked. She smiled, sipping her coffee. Big presentation. Her phone buzzed again. She read the message quickly, her lips curving into a smile she tried to hide. Javier didn't comment. He just watched. In the military, you learned that knowing was better than suspecting. And right now, he suspected plenty. But until he knew, really knew, he'd stay quiet. Because quiet was how you caught people off guard. And Javier Summers had made a career out of catching people off guard. That morning, as she drove away again, Javier stood in the driveway, hands in his pockets, eyes on the road. The neighborhood around him looked the same, safe, suburban, friendly. But to him, it was a battlefield. Only difference was the enemy this time might be sharing his bed. And somewhere deep inside, his soldier's intuition whispered the same thing over and over. Something's wrong. Chapter 2, Suspicions and Surveillance. The human mind has a way of turning suspicion into obsession. For most people, it happens slowly, a creeping doubt that eventually eats away at trust. For Javier Summers, it happened in the space of a heartbeat. He had tried ignoring it. For a week after Rebecca's girls' night, he told himself he was imagining things. But every time she smiled at her phone, every time she came home late, the soldier inside him whispered, "Don't ignore the signs." And Javier Summers had never been the type to ignore signs. It started with the cameras. The first one was hidden in the corner of the kitchen, disguised inside a smoke detector he'd modified. Another in the living room, tucked into the hollow of a decorative vase. One in the bedroom, concealed behind the vent cover. The lenses were so small, they could pass inspection from 2 feet away. He worked at night, after Rebecca was asleep, moving quietly through the house like he was back on a blacked-out compound in Afghanistan. The gear wasn't cheap. Most civilians couldn't even get it without paperwork. Javier didn't need paperwork. His contacts still owed him favors. By the end of the week, the house was wired, audio and video feeds streamed to his secure laptop upstairs. The car came next. Rebecca drove a silver Lexus RX, bought last year after she'd argued they needed something reliable. Javier waited until she went out for a pedicure one Saturday afternoon, then rolled it into the garage and popped the hood. He installed a GPS tracker smaller than a matchbox, sliding it into a cavity behind the front grille. It would ping her location every 30 seconds. Under the dashboard, he tucked a thin wire microphone, feeding into a recorder hidden under the passenger seat. When she came back, she didn't notice a thing. She just parked, kissed him on the cheek, and went upstairs to change. For 3 days, Javier collected data without even looking at it. That was the discipline. You didn't pounce on information. You let it pile up until patterns emerged. Then, on the 4th day, he sat down in his office with a mug of black coffee and opened the feeds. At first, nothing unusual: morning commutes, coffee runs, work chatter. But then, late Thursday afternoon, the Lexus didn't head toward her office after lunch. It went west, toward a strip mall. Javier clicked the drone icon on his second monitor. The drone wasn't the kind you bought at an electronics store. This one was military surplus, quiet, long range, with a 4K stabilized camera. He launched it from a park 2 miles away, guiding it to hover 100 feet above the strip mall. Through the lens, he spotted Rebecca's Lexus in the lot. She got out. She wasn't alone. A man leaned against a black Ford Explorer 2 spaces away, smiling. Sheriff's Department uniform, broad shoulders, sunglasses pushed up onto his head. Javier zoomed in. The patch on a man's arm read County Sheriff. The name tag, Morales. They didn't hug, not exactly, but they stood close, closer than strangers. Rebecca laughed at something he said, brushing her hair back in that unconscious way she always had when she was trying to impress someone. Morales, Nick, according to the tag, gestured toward the coffee shop. They went inside together. Javier didn't flinch, didn't curse. His face stayed as calm as if he were watching a weather report. But inside, his pulse thudded with the slow, heavy beat of restrained violence. That night, when Rebecca came home, Javier was on the couch watching a documentary about deep-sea divers. "How was work?" he asked. She kicked off her shoes. "Long. I'm exhausted. Traffic bad. Terrible." He smiled faintly, as if satisfied with the answer, and returned his eyes to the TV. He didn't tell her he knew she hadn't even been on the highway at rush hour. He didn't tell her he'd watched her sit across from a uniformed man for 45 minutes, her hand brushing his twice on the table. This wasn't the time for confrontation. Not yet. The next few days became an exercise in control. Javier reviewed footage each night, headphones on, eyes locked to the screens. The kitchen camera caught her on the phone, whispering in the pantry. The GPS logs showed her stopping at the same coffee shop 3 times in a week. The drone footage revealed Nick Morales' pattern, always arriving first, leaning casually against his SUV, like he owned the place. There was nothing overt enough to prove anything beyond friendly, but body language didn't lie. Morales stood too close. He angled his torso toward her every time she spoke. His smile lingered a fraction too long. Javier noted everything: timestamps, locations, distance between them. One afternoon, he tailed them. Not in the obvious way. He didn't get into his own car and follow. He parked a mile away and used the drone again, shadowing them as they left the coffee shop. They didn't go back to work. They drove to a public park, sat on a bench under a tree, and talked for half an hour. No touching, but Rebecca's laughter carried even through the drone mic when the wind shifted. When Morales left, he put a hand briefly on her arm. A short, casual touch. But Javier saw the way she froze, not in discomfort, but in hesitation. That night, Rebecca curled up next to him on the couch, watching a sitcom. "You're quiet tonight," she said. "Just tired." She glanced at him, then back at the TV. "You should take a break from work." Javier smiled faintly. "Maybe I will." She didn't know the kind of work he was doing now. By the end of the week, the picture was becoming clear. Nick Morales was no stranger. He was inserting himself into Rebecca's life with the confidence of a man who thought he had a chance. Javier's boiling rage stayed deep under the surface. He'd been trained to control his breathing in combat, to lower his heart rate before pulling a trigger. This was no different. Emotions got in the way of precision. So he kept collecting, kept watching, kept waiting. The soldier in him knew the rules. Never strike without knowing the full field. Never show your hand until the trap is ready. And Nick Morales had no idea there was already a trap being built around him, piece by piece, angle by angle, frame by frame. Chapter 3, Discovery of the Affair. It happened on a rainy Thursday night. The kind of night where streetlights bled into wet asphalt and the air smelled faintly of ozone. Javier sat in his upstairs office, the glow of 3 monitors painting his face in cold light. One screen showed GPS tracking data from Rebecca's Lexus. Another streamed a live feed from the dashcam-sized camera he'd hidden inside her rearview mirror. The third displayed audio waveforms from the bug under her dashboard. She was supposed to be at a girls' night in Midtown. Instead, the Lexus had taken the off-ramp toward Route 19. Javier leaned forward, scrolling the zoomed-in map. Route 19 didn't lead to Midtown. It led to the outskirts, an industrial stretch dotted with diners, bars, and budget motels. He switched to the camera feed just as her headlights swept into the parking lot of the Riverside Inn, a squat, brick-sided place with flickering neon. A black Ford Explorer was already there. Nick Morales stood beside it, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, scanning the lot. When Rebecca's car rolled in, his face lit up in a smile that was far too familiar for a man who was just a friend. Javier's jaw tightened, but his breathing stayed even. Through the mirrored lens, Javier watched Rebecca step out of the Lexus. Her coat was belted tight, hair perfect despite the drizzle. She looked around quickly, checking, not for him but for anyone. Then she crossed the distance and went straight into Nick's arms. The kiss wasn't a friendly peck. It was slow, deliberate. When they finally broke apart, Nick leaned down, murmuring something against her ear. The bug in the dashboard caught the faint sound once they were back in the car. Voices close to the mic. "Missed you." "I missed you too," Rebecca's voice answered, soft and low. Javier didn't blink, didn't rage. He simply clicked another window open and started recording the feed. The next 20 minutes played out like an operation briefing. Nick drove the Explorer around to the back lot. Rebecca followed in the Lexus. They parked side by side. Both got out, looking around once more before slipping into a side entrance of the motel. Javier noted the timestamp, 9:42 p.m., and the room number visible when the door closed. 2:14. He didn't watch the rest live. He'd seen enough in the field to know when something was conclusive. Instead, he cued the hallway camera he'd placed weeks earlier, an innocuous fire alarm housing mounted high in the corner outside room 214. The footage showed them re-emerging an hour and a half later. Her hair was tousled. His uniform shirt was half-buttoned, tie stuffed into his pocket. When they kissed again before parting, it was unhurried, lingering, ending with a whispered "I love you" from Rebecca that the hallway mic barely caught. The next morning, over breakfast, Rebecca scrolled her phone and smiled faintly. "How was your night?" Javier asked casually, sipping coffee. "Fun. Lisa brought that new Cabernet she's obsessed with." Javier buttered his toast. "Where'd you guys meet again?" She didn't look up. "That little wine bar on Fifth." He chewed slowly, nodding. "Sound nice." Inside, there was no turmoil, no heartbreak, just calculation. In his world, once you had confirmation, you built the file. Over the next 3 weeks, he did exactly that. Every time they met, he logged it: date, time, location, weather conditions, duration. The GPS tracker showed they alternated between the Riverside Inn and another motel off Highway 8. The audio recordings grew more explicit. Laughter turned to gasps. Whispers turned to promises. Rebecca spoke to him in a tone she hadn't used with Javier in years. Nick, for his part, talked like a man who thought he'd already won. In the evenings, Javier would sit at his desk, headphones on, listening not as a husband, but as an operator studying a target. He noticed the tells in Nick's behavior, how he avoided taking Rebecca anywhere public, how he insisted they park in the back, how he checked his watch like a man working around someone else's schedule. He also picked up on details from Nick's casual conversation. Debts, they're calling about the truck again. Gonna have to take on more overtime. Drinking, stopped at O'Malley's before meeting you, just needed to unwind. Temper, some punk at the gas station thought he could mouth off. I straightened him out. Ambition, sheriff's seat, is opening up next year. With the right push, I could get there. Javier kept a separate file, just on Nick Morales. Background checks, property records, credit reports, everything was either public record or could be obtained through the kind of databases civilians didn't know existed. Nick's debts were deep. Max credit cards, a truck loan in arrears, a second mortgage barely kept afloat. His disciplinary file at the sheriff department had 2 write-ups for excessive force that somehow never made the papers. He'd run for union rep twice and lost. Javier also found something else, a wife named Karen. Married 7 years. No kids. One night, Rebecca came home later than usual, cheeks flushed, hair windblown. Traffic? Javier asked from the couch. She kicked off her heels. Don't even get me started. He muted the TV. You ever think about taking a different route? You know, avoid the worst of it. She smiled tiredly. Maybe, but I like the drive. Javier gave a short nod, as though satisfied. She went upstairs to shower. He waited until he heard the water running before pulling out his phone, opening the GPS log. She hadn't been anywhere near the highway. By now, the affair wasn't a suspicion. It was a confirmed operation. She had her story. He had the truth. And truth was leverage. Javier didn't need to storm into a motel room or throw punches in a parking lot. That was emotion. Emotion got you sloppy. What he needed was to watch, record, and learn until the picture was complete. Every detail mattered. Nick's preferred meeting times. Rebecca's choice of perfume on those days. The way she'd sometimes park 2 blocks away from the motel before walking in, thinking, perhaps, that made her harder to track. He also began to notice how their conversations shifted. In the early weeks, it was flirty, playful. By the 3rd week, they spoke about him, Javier. I don't think he suspects anything, Rebecca murmured in one clip, her voice low but clear through the bug. Nick chuckled. What's he gonna do? He's just a computer guy, right? Javier smiled at that one. Not because it was funny, but because it told him exactly how much Nick underestimated him. And underestimation was a weapon all its own. By the end of the month, Javier's file on Nick Morales was thick enough to fill a briefcase. The man's patterns were predictable, his weaknesses glaring. Rebecca's were even more so. Javier didn't feel heartbreak. He didn't feel betrayal in the way most men did. What he felt was a sharpening of focus. This wasn't about winning her back. This was about control. And control required patience. So he closed the laptop one night, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. The plan was forming. Nick Morales had debts. He drank too much. He had a temper. He wanted power. And Javier Summers had just decided to use every single one of those things against him. Chapter 4, The Setup. The file on Nick Morales was thick enough to crush a desk drawer. Dates, times, video clips, financial records, disciplinary reports, all of it neatly cataloged. Javier had the proof. Now he needed the stage. This wasn't going to be a screaming match in a driveway or a fist fight in a parking lot. Those were messy, public, and left trails. No, this had to be precise, contained, and entirely on his terms. He needed Nick alone with Rebecca, in a setting where Javier could control the angles and the narrative. The perfect stage was a traffic stop. The first step was getting Rebecca's license plate flagged in the county system. Javier spent 2 hours in his upstairs office, fingers flying across the keyboard, accessing networks he wasn't supposed to know existed. The county sheriff's department server wasn't exactly a fortress. It relied on outdated security protocols, the kind you could peel apart if you'd ever worked in signals intelligence. Javier had. By the time the sun came up, Rebecca's plate number was sitting in the possible vehicle of interest database. Not enough to prompt an armed response, but enough to trigger a pullover if a certain deputy happened to run it. That certain deputy part was trickier. Javier couldn't leave it to chance, which meant calling in a favor. He scrolled to a number he hadn't dialed in over a year and hit call. Christ, Javier Summers. A gravelly voice answered on the second ring. Didn't think you were still breathing. Still breathing, Javier said. Still working. The man laughed. You calling to reminisce about Fallujah? Or, is this business? Business, Javier said. I need a particular deputy to get a particular traffic stop. Uh-huh. And you figure dispatch can make that happen. You still in the chair on B shift. A pause. Yeah. Who's the deputy? Nick Morales. Another pause, heavier this time. Morales is a cowboy. What's your play? Javier's tone stayed flat. Nothing that'll splash back on you. I just need him in the right place, right time. The voice sighed. Send me the plate and the window you want to run. I'll make sure it's on his screen. Javier ended the call without another word. Next came a gear. He opened the long, narrow gun safe at the back of his closet, Not the one Rebecca knew about, but the hidden panel behind the shelving. Inside was a lifetime's worth of tools. Suppressed pistols, compact carbines, blades balanced for throwing, bundles of zip ties, encrypted comm units. For tonight, he didn't need the carbine. He selected a short-barrel 9mm with a threaded suppressor, slipped it into a pancake holster under his jacket. In another compartment, he pulled out a slim recorder about the size of a credit card with a high-gain mic. It would pick up every word within 20 feet. Then came the armor. Not full tactical body armor. That would be too conspicuous, but a custom-cut Kevlar vest under a matte black windbreaker. Last, a pair of gloves. Leather, unlined. They didn't just protect, they erased fingerprints. By early evening, he was in motion. He knew Rebecca's Thursday routine by heart now. She'd leave the house at 7:15, dressed like she was going to dinner with friends. Tonight, she was wearing a deep green dress, hair straightened, makeup perfect. Going out, he asked from the doorway as she grabbed her clutch. "Yeah, girls' night," she said with the same breezy tone she always used. He smiled faintly. "Have fun." She left without noticing that his car wasn't in the driveway. He'd parked 2 streets over. Javier tailed her without ever being behind her. GPS data streamed to his phone, showing her heading toward the same stretch of highway that led, eventually, to Nick Morales. At exactly 7:42 p.m., the flag in the county system tripped. In a quiet dispatch office across town, a familiar voice routed the call directly to Morales' cruiser. Javier pictured the moment Morales' screen lit up. Vehicle of interest, possible connection to an ongoing investigation. Routine stuff, except for the fact that the investigation didn't exist. He positioned himself on a side road, half a mile from the highway pull-off he knew Morales favored. It was dark here, no streetlights, just the glow of headlights as cars passed. Minutes later, the pattern unfolded like clockwork. Rebecca's Lexus rolled by. Morales' Ford Explorer appeared seconds later, sliding into the lane behind her. Red and blue lights flashed. The Lexus slowed, pulling to the shoulder. Morales' door opened. He stepped out in full uniform, hand resting casually on his hip, the way cops do when they want to look authoritative without looking hostile. Javier's fingers closed around the recorder in his pocket. He moved now, slipping from his car and into the tree line. The wet ground muffled his steps. From here, he could see everything, the Lexus idling, Rebecca visible through the driver's side window, Morales leaning down to talk to her. She smiled. Of course she smiled. Javier crouched low, windbreaker brushing the damp leaves. He pressed the recorder's activation switch. The tiny light blinked once, then went dark, capturing every sound. Morales' voice carried just enough to reach him. "Evening, ma'am. Gotta report your plate. Might match a vehicle involved in something. Probably nothing, but I'll need to run your ID." Rebecca's laugh was soft, almost flirty. "You're really pulling me over? Couldn't you just text me?" Morales chuckled. "Procedure, you know how it is." Javier's grip tightened on the recorder, not from nerves, but from the discipline of holding still. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He let them talk. Let Morales run her ID back to his cruiser. Let the scene play out exactly as it needed to. Because tonight wasn't about confrontation. It was about putting every piece in place, setting the hook without them even feeling the line. And Javier Summers was already in the shadows, waiting for the next move. Chapter 5, The Traffic Stop Showdown. The night was cold enough to make the air bite, the kind of crisp darkness that made every sound sharper. Rebecca's silver sedan slowed under the flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. She eased to the side of the Tulane County Road, half smiling to herself as though she already knew who it was. Nick Morales' patrol cruiser rolled up behind her, his headlights cutting across the blacktop. He took his time getting out, the confidence in his stride almost theatrical. The brim of his sheriff's deputy hat shadowed his eyes, but Rebecca recognized his smirk immediately. "Evening, ma'am," Nick said with a low chuckle as he leaned in toward the driver's side. "You know why I stopped you?" Rebecca tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Speeding," she teased, her voice sugary and dripping with an inside joke only the two of them understood. Nick shook his head slightly, leaning his forearm casually on the car roof. Just thought I'd check on you. Make sure you were safe. The pause in his words was deliberate. What neither of them knew was that Javier was already there. Hidden in the tree line about 50 yards back, Javier Summers watched the scene unfold through the green tint of his night vision. Black tactical gear blended him into the darkness. His heart rate was steady, calm, trained calm, not the tremble of a jealous husband, but the poise of a man who'd neutralized threats in sand-blown deserts halfway across the world. Nick leaned in closer, his free hand resting on the edge of Rebecca's open window. "How about we take this somewhere less public?" he murmured. Rebecca giggled softly, brushing her hair back from her face. She didn't even notice the crunch of boots on gravel behind them. Nick's hand instinctively went to his sidearm when he caught movement in his peripheral vision. A dark figure emerged from the shadows, slow, deliberate. Who the hell? Javier stepped fully into the pale wash of the cruiser's headlights. Black fatigues, combat boots, Kevlar vest. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of a black cap, but his posture was unmistakable, upright, locked, dangerous. Rebecca's jaw dropped. "Javier?" Nick straightened, squaring his shoulders like he was about to puff his chest. "Sir, step back. This is a traffic stop." Javier's voice came out cold, stripped of emotion. "No, Deputy Morales. This is my stop." Nick blinked, thrown off that the stranger knew his name. "I said step back. You're interfering with—" Rebecca leaned toward Nick, her tone dripping venom toward Javier. "Honey, this coward soldier might pee in his pants if you threaten him like this." Nick smirked at her remark, turning his attention back to Javier. "All right, tough guy. Turn around, hands behind your back." Javier didn't move. Instead, he reached into a pouch on his vest and pulled out a small black device the size of a deck of cards. The LED light blinked red. "Before you touch me," Javier said, "you should know that this entire conversation is being recorded and streamed to multiple locations." Nick's brow furrowed. "The hell are you talking about?" Javier stepped closer, his voice dropping lower. "You're in debt, $32,000 to a loan shark named Vince Albright. Your wife, Karen, has been wondering why you've been working so many night shifts. And the woman you've been meeting at the Crestview Motel, she's been telling people you're leaving your wife for her." Nick froze, his grip tightening on his holstered pistol. Rebecca's face went pale. "Javier, stop." Javier ignored her. "Your badge number is 472. The last time you filed an arrest report, you forgot to include the evidence inventory. You've been sloppy, Nick. Real sloppy." Nick's Adam's apple bobbed. His bravado was starting to crack. "Who the hell are you?" Javier tilted his head, the faintest ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Someone who knows more about you than you know about yourself." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady hum of the cruiser's engine. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. "Javier, just go home. This isn't what you think." He finally turned to her, his gaze cutting sharp through the shadows. "It's exactly what I think." Nick took a step forward, his hand twitching toward his cuffs. "You need to walk away before this gets—" Javier's voice sliced through him. "Before this gets what, deputy? Violent? You want to test that?" Nick's eyes flicked to the gear on Javier's vest, the holstered sidearm, the tactical knife strapped to his thigh, the faint bulge of other weapons he couldn't quite identify. This wasn't some suburban husband out for a fight. This was someone who'd been in them. Javier closed the distance, standing just inches from Nick now. His words were quiet, but each one landed like a hammer. "You're going to forget this night. You're going to stay away from my wife. And if you even think about using your badge to come after me, you'll find out just how far I'm willing to go to make sure you never wear it again." Nick didn't answer. He didn't move. Javier shifted his gaze to Rebecca. "Get out of the car." She hesitated, glancing at Nick as if expecting him to stop it. But Nick said nothing. His lips were pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Rebecca opened the door slowly, her heels clicking on the asphalt as she stepped out. Javier took her arm, not roughly, but firmly, and began walking her past Nick toward the darkness he'd come from. Nick finally found his voice. "You can't just—" Javier didn't look back. "I already did. They disappeared into the shadows, leaving Nick standing under the harsh red and blue strobe of his own patrol lights, the night suddenly much colder than it had been before. Chapter 6. The Command Center Revelation. The night swallowed them whole by the time Javier guided Rebecca through the back door. Her heels clicked against the hardwood, sharp and defiant, though he could feel the tremor in her step. She'd stayed quiet the whole drive home, more from shock than from guilt, he suspected. The street outside was dead quiet, neighbors tucked away in their tidy homes, unaware of the war zone brewing behind one of their own white picket fences. Javier locked the door, twisted the deadbolt, and then did something Rebecca had never seen in all their years of marriage. He keyed in a hidden code on the digital thermostat. A faint, almost imperceptible click echoed from somewhere inside the house. What was that?" she asked, her voice sharp but carrying the tremor of uncertainty. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the laundry room, knelt down, and slid the washer forward with a casual strength that made her step back. Behind it, a steel panel blinked with a biometric scanner. Javier pressed his thumb to it, leaned in for a retinal scan, and the panel hissed open. "Javier, what the hell is this?" "Step inside," he said, his voice flat, not a request. The steel door swung open into a staircase descending into shadow. She hesitated at the threshold, eyes darting from the dark opening to his face. His gaze was unreadable, cold, steady, the same expression she'd seen during arguments, but now stripped of even the faintest warmth. She stepped down, each stair creaking under her weight. The smell changed, no longer the lavender-scented air of their home, but cold concrete, steel, and faint electronics. The lights came alive as motion sensors detected them, revealing a space she couldn't have imagined existed beneath their home. It wasn't a basement, it was a war room. 6 50-inch monitors lined one wall, all glowing with paused video feeds, maps, and documents. A workbench stretched across the opposite wall, littered with tools, military-grade communication gear, and enough surveillance equipment to make a government agent nervous. In the center of the room, a large table was covered with maps of the county, each marked with red circles, dates, and photographs pinned in precise patterns. Rebecca stopped halfway in, eyes wide. What is this place?" Javier closed the steel door behind them. "Command center," he said, moving past her to the monitors. "Mine." She spun to face him. "Your? Since when do you have some kind of underground spy bunker under our house?" "Since before you even met me." His fingers tapped on a keyboard, and one of the screens flickered to life. The video began to play. It was Rebecca, walking out of a bar in a red dress, brushing her hair back, smiling at someone just off camera. Then Nick appeared. He put his hand on her waist, leaning in, saying something she couldn't hear. She laughed, tilting her head toward him. They kissed, slow, intimate, without hesitation. Her face went pale. "Where did you get?" Javier cut her off. "June 14th. You told me you were going to a girls' night. Instead, you met Nick Morales at the Brass Lantern. You left together at 11:47 p.m. You checked into the Sunset Motel on Route 9 under the name Mr. and Mrs. Collins. Room 12. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The facts landed harder than any shout could. Another monitor came to life, different footage. Rebecca getting into Nick's truck, Nick's hand sliding over her thigh. Later, the two of them in the corner booth of a quiet diner, their heads close together. The camera's microphone caught muffled laughter, the distinct phrase, "I love you." Rebecca's voice cracked. "You've been spying on me?" "I've been watching you," Javier corrected. "There's a difference. Spying is for strangers. This is called verification." She took a step back. You planted cameras? In your car. In the house. In the motel room you thought was safe." Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again. That's what I do," Javier said, turning to face her fully for the first time since they entered the room. "You think I was just some soldier who came home and started fixing fences for a living? No. Special operations. Black ops. Missions that never made the news. People who never existed on paper. I was the ghost they sent in when no one else could finish the job." She stared at him as though seeing him for the first time. "You kill people?" "Sometimes," he said bluntly, "when a mission required it." Rebecca's knees almost buckled. She glanced around at the room again, the walls suddenly feeling like they were closing in. Why are you telling me this now? Because now it matters. He pressed another button, and the monitors changed again. This time, the images weren't of her and Nick, they were of Judge Harold Miller, her father. Public appearances, courthouse steps, handshakes with city officials. But mixed in were grainy photos of him in private meetings, dimly lit restaurants, a golf course, the back room of a cigar lounge. In every single one, the same man appeared at his side, a man Rebecca recognized from news reports. Vincent Kellerman, head of the Kellerman crime family. Her voice came out in a whisper. That's Kellerman, Javier finished. Your father's been meeting with him for years. And guess who's been playing errand boy for that little partnership? He switched the screen again. There was Nick, in uniform, handing a manila envelope to another officer in a dark alley. Another clip showed Nick in casual clothes, talking to Kellerman's driver. The last clip was the most damning. Nick, your lover, sitting across from Kellerman himself in that same cigar lounge, shaking hands. Rebecca's head shook slowly, disbelief fighting reality. Nick works for Kellerman? Javier stepped closer, his voice a low, controlled growl. Nick's not just a dirty cop. He's the link between your father's bench and Kellerman's empire. He feeds him intel, buries charges, makes sure the wrong people stay out of prison. And you've been in his bed, giving him everything he needs to get even closer to your family. Her hands trembled. I didn't know, no, Javier said sharply. You didn't care to know? You were too busy sneaking around, telling yourself it was harmless, that you deserve a little fun while your boring soldier husband worked late nights. She swallowed hard, her eyes glassy. I thought you didn't notice. I thought you thought wrong. The silence that followed was suffocating. The hum of the monitors was the only sound between them. Rebecca looked from one damning image to another, her mind spinning. The affair had felt like a private rebellion against a husband she thought had grown distant, maybe even weak. Now she was seeing it for what it really was, an open door sheet handed to a man tied to criminals, to a network that reached right in her own bloodline. Her voice was small. Javier, what happens now? Javier didn't answer right away. He simply turned off the monitors one by one, leaving the room in dim light. Now, he said, you start to understand exactly how far this goes. And with that, he stepped past her, heading toward the steel door, leaving her alone with the weight of every truth she'd just heard. Chapter 7, Turning the Tables. Rebecca sat stiffly in the chair across from Javier in the dim light of the command room. The monitors still glowed with frozen frames of her and Nick, hotel lobbies, parking lots, intimate moments she could no longer deny. Her hands were clasped together in her lap, fingers twisting nervously. Javier stood, hands resting on the table, his gaze drilling into her like a sniper's sight. Rebecca, he said evenly, you're going to start working for me now. She scoffed, but her voice wavered. Work for you? What is this? This Javier cut in sharply. Is the only way you walk out of this without losing everything. Her eyes darted toward the screens again. You wouldn't. Javier leaned closer, lowering his voice to a dangerous calm. I've already done worse to worse people. You think I won't? You've been running around with a sheriff's deputy who's tied to organized crime. Your father, our judge, is tangled in it too. And now, so are you. Rebecca swallowed hard. What do you want from me? I want information, Javier said. Details, conversations, where Harold goes, who he meets, what he says. And Nick texts, calls his drinking spots his debt collectors. You keep your ears open and your mouth shut. Feed me everything. She hesitated, arms folding protectively. And if I say no? Javier straightened, eyes cold. Then I dump this, he tapped the screens, on every media outlet, police department, and courthouse in the state. I'll let your father's enemies eat him alive, and I'll watch Nick's career end before sunrise. Silence stretched. Rebecca's lips trembled before she finally nodded. Fine, I'll cooperate. Javier's voice softened, but only slightly. Good. You've got one chance to prove you're worth keeping in the game. 2 days later, Javier sat in his truck outside a quiet suburban ranch house. He wasn't here for Rebecca this time. The porch light flickered on, and a woman stepped out, late 30s, athletic build, brunette hair tied back. She carried herself like someone who'd had to hold a family together by herself for far too long. Karen Morales, Nick's wife. Javier waited until she stepped toward the mailbox before calling out. Mrs. Morales? She stopped, squinting at him. Do I know you? No, Javier said, stepping forward with calculated slowness. But I know your husband. Her expression froze instantly. If you're here to complain about some traffic ticket, Javier shook his head. I'm here because you deserve to know the truth. He pulled a small envelope from his jacket and held it out. Karen eyed it suspiciously, then took it. She opened it, brows knitting as she flipped through printed photos. The breath left her in a sharp exhale. That son of a... She cut herself off, her voice shaking. When were these taken? Past 6 months, Javier said. Your husband's been using his badge as cover for private meetups with my wife. Motels, bars, back alleys. I have video too. Karen stared at the photos, her jaw tightening. Why are you telling me this? Because Nick's the type who thinks he can bury his mistakes, Javier replied. I'm making sure he doesn't bury you in the process. Do with it what you want. But if you want to make it public, I can make that happen fast. Karen looked up at him, a storm gathering in her eyes. Oh, I'll make it public. You can count on that. 2 nights later, the county's law enforcement fundraising gala was in full swing. Local politicians, donors, and department heads filled the room. Javier wasn't there, but his drone was quietly perched on a rooftop outside with a camera zoomed in through the banquet hall windows. He watched from his command center as Karen Morales made her move. She was a vision of icy control in a sleek black dress, standing at the podium during an open mic donation segment. I want to thank everyone here for supporting our brave deputies, she began, voice steady. But I also want to remind everyone that integrity starts at home. And sometimes it's not there. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen smiled, sharp and merciless, and pulled out an enlarged photo from the envelope Javier had given her. This is Deputy Nick Morales, she said, taken during his on-duty hours. That's not me in the photo. That's another man's wife. The crowd erupted. Some gasped, others whispered in shock. Nick, standing near the back, went pale. Javier zoomed in on his face through the drone feed, every twitch, every flinch. Karen finished with a venom-laced smile. Our deputies should serve the people, not serve themselves. She dropped the photo on the podium and walked out, head high. Javier leaned back in his chair, satisfied. One domino down. The next target was Harold Miller, Rebecca's father. Javier didn't bother with subtlety. He called Harold's private chambers directly, his voice calm but loaded with intent. Judge Miller, who is this? Harold's tone was clipped, irritated. Someone who knows about your meetings with the Kellerman family, and about how you used Deputy Morales to pass messages. I also know about the offshore account in Belize. A long pause. You're bluffing. Javier smiled to himself. Check your personal email. I've sent you a fraction of what I have. The line went silent. Javier pictured Harold scrolling through the files, meeting transcripts, bank statements, phone logs. Enough to make a man sweat through his expensive suit. What do you want? Harold finally asked. You're going to start handing down rulings that I approve, Javier said. Bail decisions, case dismissals, quiet transfers, nothing flashy. And you're going to keep your hands very clean in public. Harold's voice hardened. If I refuse, then I release everything to the State Ethics Board, the feds, and your political opponents. And I'll make sure your friends in the Kellerman family know you're the one who leaked. Another silence. Then, fine, send me the list. Javier's voice was almost friendly. Good man, we'll be in touch. That night, Rebecca came down to the basement, standing in the doorway as Javier typed at his workstation. You've been busy, she said softly. Javier didn't look up. You've been useful. I gave you what you asked for. And I used it, he said. Nick's career is in free fall. Your father's under my thumb. The Kellermans are going to start feeling the shift soon. Rebecca lingered in the doorway, chewing her lip. So what happens now? Javier finally turned to her, his eyes like steel. Now, we wait for the next opening. And with that, Javier leaned back in his chair, the quiet hum of the monitors filling the room. His enemies were starting to feel the pressure, and for Javier Summers, that was just the beginning. Chapter 8, Striking the Kellermans. The rain fell in slow, deliberate sheets over the city, the kind of weather that made honest men stay indoors and criminals feel bold. Javier Summers stood in the corner of a shadow-drenched parking garage, eyes locked on a silver Mercedes S-Class 2 levels down. Maurice Gonzalez, the Kellerman's money launderer, accountant, and occasional fixer, had just finished his Friday night meeting with two of his underlings. Javier had been following him for weeks, tracking his habits, noting when he was alone, when he was protected, and when the armor came off. Tonight, Maurice was alone, and tonight, Maurice would have an accident. Javier adjusted the earpiece snug in his ear. Static crackled softly, a background hum that kept him centered. Confirmed target, came the low voice of Mick Dalton, his old recon partner, patching in from a van parked 2 blocks away. Confirmed, Javier replied, his voice like cold steel. Silver Mercedes, license ending in 849. No security detail. He's carrying the black attaché case. That's the one. Javier moved with quiet precision. No wasted steps. No sound that would echo. He descended the concrete ramp, blending with the occasional footstep of late-night commuters. When he reached the level where Maurice had parked, he was already behind a pillar, 30 feet away, invisible in the darkness. Maurice was on his phone, laughing an arrogant, nasal chuckle that carried in the still air. Nah, Benny, I told you. The accounts are tight. The feds ain't sniffing around. You think I don't know my business? Javier slipped a thin metal tool from his pocket, a small, military-issue remote frequency jammer. One press, and Morris's phone went dead mid-laugh. What the? Maurice muttered, pulling it away from his ear and staring at the screen. He turned toward his car, fumbling for his keys. Javier moved. Fast, silent, lethal. He closed the distance in seconds, staying in Morris's blind spot until the last moment. His left hand clamped over Morris's mouth, his right pressing a stunned baton into his ribs. The shock was silent but brutal. Morris's knees buckled instantly. Javier whispered, "This isn't personal, but you made your money dirty, and dirty money leaves a trail." Before Maurice could respond, Javier dragged him behind a row of parked SUVs, away from the camera's blind spot Javier had already mapped. A quick, efficient motion, a chokehold that cut off blood flow in under 8 seconds. By the time Morris's body went limp, Javier had already fished the Mercedes key fob from his pocket. The rest was staging. Javier loaded Maurice into the driver's seat, buckled the belt, and set the vehicle in neutral. From his tactical bag, he produced a heavy wedge, sliding it under the accelerator pedal. He lined the car perfectly with the ramp that dropped into the lower level, where the safety barrier had been coincidentally removed during maintenance the day before. One swift push, and gravity did the rest. The Mercedes rolled forward, picked up speed, and slammed into the far wall with a metallic scream. The hood crumpled, the airbags deployed, and the front end smoked heavily. To any investigator, it would look like a tragic case of a driver losing control while distracted. Maurice Gonzalez, the Kellerman's golden accountant, was now just another name in a police report. By sunrise, Javier was sitting in his basement command room, sipping coffee and scrolling through the encrypted files he'd pulled from Morris's attaché case before the crash. They were pure gold, offshore account numbers, shell corporation registries, bribe ledgers. The kind of evidence that would take down half the Kellerman financial network. He didn't plan to hand it directly to the authorities. No, Javier played the long game. He inserted the data into a hidden subfolder on Judge Harold Miller's work laptop, a laptop he had accessed remotely using a drive-by download exploit 2 nights prior. When the FBI inevitably traced the tip-off, it would appear Harold had stumbled upon the evidence through confidential judicial channels and graciously provided it to them. Harold would look like a hero. The Kellermans would lose their money man. And Javier? He'd still be invisible. 3 days later, the FBI kicked in the doors of 3 Kellerman-owned warehouses across the county. Javier watched the live news feed, the corners of his mouth twitching in a faint, satisfied smirk. Agents poured out carrying black duffel bags stuffed with files, electronics, and cash. On screen, the anchor spoke breathlessly. Sources say this is part of a multi-state operation targeting organized crime syndicates, including the Kellerman family. Several high-ranking associates have been taken into custody. Javier muted the TV and pulled up a private feed, the FBI's internal field report, courtesy of mixed cyber infiltration. The list of arrested names scrolled down the screen. 2 mid-tier enforcers, a warehouse manager, and a corporate front executive. No Kellerman heads yet, but the roots were being torn out. Across town, Nick Morales was having a very bad week. The suspension hit him like a sledgehammer. On paper, it was pending internal review regarding potential misconduct and corruption-related allegations. In reality, it was the fallout from Karen, his own wife, now armed with the damning affair evidence Javier had fed her. She'd gone public, her post dripping with venom, tagging the sheriff's office and half the county council. Javier imagined the scene at the station. Nick storming in, red-faced, barking at anyone who would listen. He'd demand to know who set him up. He'd suspect everyone. And yet, he'd never suspect the quiet man in the suburbs who had been 3 steps ahead all along. Late that night, Harold Miller called Rebecca. Javier didn't need to bug the call. Rebecca put it on speaker while Javier stood across the room, arms folded. "Rebecca," Harold's voice was low, urgent. "The FBI just came to me. They say I helped them with some evidence against the Kellermans. I don't even remember doing anything like that." "You did the right thing, Dad," Rebecca said, glancing at Javier for guidance. There was a pause on the line. "Right thing or not, this is dangerous. These people, they don't forgive. But if it buys us goodwill with the feds, maybe it's worth it." Javier stayed silent. Harold was already buying into the story. That was enough for tonight. 2 days later, the headlines read, "FBI strikes major blow to Kellerman crime family. Local judge crucial in case." Harold Miller's photo was front and center, shaking hands with a federal prosecutor. His smile was measured, almost cautious, but it was there. Javier closed the browser and leaned back in his chair. The first domino had fallen. The Kellermans were weaker, their allies shaken, and their money pipeline severed. Harold was rising politically, oblivious to how his heroism had been orchestrated. Nick was off the streets and bleeding reputation. Every piece was exactly where Javier wanted it, and the game was far from over. Chapter 9, Pier 19 Ambush. The salty wind whipped off the harbor as Javier Summers crouched behind a rusted shipping container at Pier 19. Night had settled like a shroud over the dockyard, the only light coming from the flickering lamps mounted on cranes and warehouse roofs. The scent of brine and diesel mingled with the faint hum of distant ship engines. Javier's breath came slow and controlled through the tactical mask. Every detail of the operation was etched into his mind. Sniper positions secured, escape routes mapped, explosive charges carefully planted beneath the main loading dock. He tapped his earpiece. "Positions check," he whispered. "Alpha team in place," came the calm reply from Mick Dalton. "Bravo team ready," another voice confirmed. Javier's gaze scanned the empty pier ahead. Tonight was the night he would dismantle the Kellerman's grip once and for all. The plan was simple. Lure Edgar Swanson, the shadowy boss of the Kellerman family, into a controlled kill zone. No loose ends, no collateral damage, just clean and final. As he adjusted his scope, a sudden movement caught his eye, a figure approaching the far end of the dock, footsteps light but purposeful. Javier's heart skipped. It was Rebecca. Her heels clicked softly against the concrete, eyes darting nervously. Javier's earpiece crackled. "Is that Rebecca?" Javier hissed through the mic, "Get out of there. Now." But Rebecca was already weaving through crates, a second figure trailing closely behind. Nick Morales. Javier's jaw tightened. She was supposed to stay away. She was supposed to trust him. Minutes later, Javier watched as Rebecca stopped near the meeting point, her voice urgent but hushed. Nick's head whipped toward the shadows, fingers twitching near his holster. "I don't care what you think, Javier. You're not the only one with stakes in this." Rebecca's tone was desperate, pleading. I had to warn you. Javier's fists clenched. The carefully laid trap was unraveling. Then the gunfire erupted. Crack! Crack! Bullets tore through the air, ricocheting off metal crates. The silence of the pier shattered as armed men stormed the meeting point. Javier dove behind cover, heart hammering as he surveyed the chaos. Swanson's men were skilled, guns blazing, tactics precise. He tapped his comm. Engage. Target Swanson. Protect civilians. From his sniper nest, Javier picked off 2 attackers moving behind a fuel container. His shots were surgical, silent. One went down before he could blink. The other didn't make it past the second round. On the ground, gunfire flared closer. Javier rolled, firing burst from his rifle, pushing forward toward the main warehouse. Suddenly, a shout. Javier! Nick's hit! Javier's head snapped toward the voice. Nick staggered, clutching his abdomen, blood blossoming through his fingers. A bullet had pierced his side. Javier didn't hesitate. He raced to Nick's side, dragging him behind a stack of crates. Nick's face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. You'll be okay, Javier muttered, pressing a hand firmly against the wound to stem the bleeding. Hold on. Nick coughed, grimacing. I'm sorry for everything. Javier's eyes hardened. Don't waste your breath. Meanwhile, Rebecca was pinned down nearby, trembling but watching Javier move with deadly precision. She saw him dispatch 2 more gunmen, then zero in on Edgar Swanson himself, a tall, burly man moving with a predator's grace despite his years. Swanson fired wildly, yelling curses, but Javier was faster. A single bullet hit Swanson's shoulder, and he staggered, clutching the wound. Javier closed the distance, switching to his sidearm as Swanson drew a pistol. The 2 men collided in brutal close-quarters combat. Steel slammed against steel. Javier's training took over. He disarmed Swanson with a swift move and pressed the barrel of his gun to the man's temple. Game over, Javier said, voice low but absolute. Swanson's defiant glare flickered once before his eyes rolled back. Javier pulled the trigger. The firefight was over. Javier looked back toward Rebecca, who was shaking as she emerged from cover. He grabbed her arm, pulling her close. We're done here, he said. She nodded, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Javier turned back to Nick, who was still barely conscious but stable. He quickly applied a makeshift tourniquet from his tactical kit. Mercy doesn't mean forgiveness, Javier said coldly, eyes locked on Rebecca. Remember that. Rebecca swallowed hard, the weight of the night crushing her resolve. The sirens wailed in the distance as backup arrived. Javier carried Nick carefully toward the extraction point, knowing this was only the beginning of a war far from over. Chapter 10, Aftermath and Departure. The courtroom was silent, except for the scratch of pens and the occasional shuffle of papers. 6 months had passed since the violent showdown at Pier 19, 6 months of investigations, indictments, and the slow, grinding collapse of the Kellerman Empire. Javier Summers sat rigidly in the back row, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. The judge, none other than Harold Miller, looked down from the bench, his face a mask of practiced solemnity. The divorce decree was read aloud, cold and final. Rebecca Miller Morales was awarded nothing, no house, no assets, no alimony. Based on the evidence presented and the conduct of the parties, Judge Miller intoned, the court finds in favor of Mr. Summers. The marriage is hereby dissolved. Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked at Javier, her eyes hollow but resigned. He gave no reaction. There was no relief, no gloating, only the steady calm of a man who had long ago made peace with the cost of his choices. Later that afternoon, Rebecca sat on the threadbare couch in a modest apartment on the city's outskirts. The place was cluttered with medical equipment. A wheelchair parked beside the door, a stack of medication bottles on the table. Nick Morales was there, slumped against pillows, his face pale and drawn. The bullet wound from Pier 19 had left him permanently disabled, his leg now a useless appendage, the pain a constant reminder of his recklessness. Rebecca reached out, clasping his hand tightly. I'm sorry, Nick. I didn't want any of this to happen. Nick gave a weak smile. You didn't have a choice. We're both trapped now. She closed her eyes, guilt weighing heavily on her chest. Staying with Nick was her penance, her way of making up for the years of betrayal and destruction. Meanwhile, in the polished chambers of the county courthouse, Harold Miller sat behind his desk, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. His political capital had soared since the FBI raids. Official statements praising his instrumental role in the Kellerman takedown were circulating in local news. Harold accepted interviews with ease, playing the part of the upstanding judge who had cleansed the city's corruption. Behind closed doors, Harold poured himself a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the light. He allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability, staring out the window at the city skyline. So far, so good, he thought. But the game is far from over. Javier, meanwhile, was far from the courtroom dramas and media spotlight. His military record had been quietly expunged, classified operations, deep cover missions, and off-the-books actions wiped clean in bureaucratic back channels. A small victory, but one he hadn't sought. The night before his departure, Javier packed his duffel bag methodically in the sparse guest room of his old suburban house. The walls, once filled with family photos, were bare. His phone buzzed, a secure line from an old commander. "Summers, mission briefing is ready. You're up in 48 hours. Classified. No questions." Javier's jaw tightened. Understood. He glanced once more around the empty room, then stepped outside. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of impending rain. At the airport, Javier waited alone near Gate 17. His black tactical jacket was folded neatly over one arm. His eyes scanned the crowd. Soldiers returning from deployment, families reunited, travelers lost in their own worlds. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out, tentative but filled with regret. "Javier." He turned slowly. Rebecca stood there, her face pale, eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for everything." Javier studied her for a long moment, then shook his head slightly. "Forgiveness," he said, voice low and steady, "is for people who deserve second chances." Rebecca's lips parted to argue, but Javier simply turned away. The boarding call echoed through the terminal. Javier picked up his bag and walked toward the gate. As the plane's engines roared to life, Javier settled into his seat, the world outside the window blurring into streaks of light. He was vanishing again into shadows, into wars nobody would know about, into missions that demanded silence and precision. This was his true life, a predator among ghosts. And this time, there would be no turning back.